Good evening, everyone. My name is Becky. I'm the Programming and Collection Development Librarian here at Storrs Library. Tonight we have Soldiers of Production, the Springfield Armory in World War II. So tonight we're going to talk about the local citizens who worked at the Springfield Armory, especially those during World War II. And we'll talk a bit about production, but really this is about the soldiers of production, the people at home who helped to make that possible. We have Park Ranger Susan Ashman, my apologies, joining us. Susan is an interpretive park ranger and the Historic Weapons Supervisor at the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. And she's going to be sharing these stories, some of the archives about the Springfield Armory and these workers. And I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors today, the Longmeadow Historical Society, for helping to put this presentation together and for joining us tonight. And with that, Susan, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to tune into my presentation. I really hope you will not only learn something new about the Springfield Armory, but also if you haven't come by the Springfield Armory, I really hope that you do. We were closed for 17 months due to COVID and some construction, some infrastructure repairs. So we are just so happy to greet visitors Wednesday through Sunday now. So please stop by. Before discussing what it was like working at the Armory during World War II, I just want to talk briefly how the Armory was established. So the Armory is broken up into 3 campuses. We have the historic hill shops. That is where the main arsenal, the picture that you see here, is located, which our museum is there as well. And this is on the campus of Springfield Technical Community College. And if you've been on the campus, you're going to note that it's more of a park-like set in there. There's a nice green in front. There's a green in back of the historic arsenal as well. And that is because officers live there. So they wanted a more quiet area for them. Across the street from the historic hill shops is Federal Square. And that was built for the production of the Craig Jorgensen in 1890, and that was used during the Spanish-American War. That is now a technology park and owned by the state. And then 3/4 of a mile down the street is the water shops. And we always refer those to the heartbeat of the Armory. That was where a lot of the dirty work was done there. And many people who their families worked at the Armory or lived there when the Armory was in operation, they said they could hear the forges like round the clock there. So the Springfield Armory manufactured small arms for the US military for 174 years, from 1794 to 1968. And this was under the Army Ordnance Department at that time. So before the Revolutionary War, we were mainly importing firearms. An arsenal was established in Springfield for the Continental Army in 1777. So ammunition was manufactured, weapons repaired, Army supplies were stockpiled, and artillery was maintained at the site. And this was all good, but George Washington felt if we were fighting for our independence at that time, then we really should, have our own manufacturing site instead of relying on these foreign arms. Because what would happen if we go to war with that country that we are relying for arms for? So from the recommendation of Henry Knox, George Washington chose Springfield as the site of our first national armory. And I'm really curious if anybody knows what other sites were in the run-in for the site of our first national armory. So I think Becky is going to unmute you if anybody would like to try to answer that question.
Yep, and everybody has the option to unmute themselves if you'd like. Again, you're welcome to use the chat box as well, and I'll convey those messages for you.
Nobody?
It looks like pretty much everyone is still muted, so we might not answer.
So So some of those options I think people will be surprised at is Brookfield. Brookfield, Mass was one. I live close to Brookfield, and I'm not sure how that would work there for an armory, and especially the water supply. But also Hartford, which that pretty much makes sense there. So why Springfield?
So we did have a guest. Someone said Harpers Ferry in the chat box. I just wanted to share that.
Okay, and we're going to get to Harpers Ferry too. That's great. So why Springfield is the town was located at the intersection of the Colonial Highway. So you had the Boston Post Road there. The Connecticut River, it was close, but it was far enough upstream to be safe from enemy attacks. It's hard to imagine ships coming up the Connecticut River, but you never know. Mills were located all along the river. So if you needed that lumber, you had the sawmills, you had grist mills all along there, and you had supplies and a workforce that were close at hand. So that's really important when you're thinking of building something, to have that workforce and supplies. So, and describing the location, General Knox said, the plain just above Springfield is perhaps one of the most proper spots on every account. I think that's pretty neat because that is exactly where the arsenal was built, on this plain. And it must have been a beautiful view before all those apartments and buildings got in there, directly to the Connecticut River to see that. So when Congress authorized the founding of the Springfield Armory up north, they also authorized one down south. So you're right, Harpers Ferry. So Harpers Ferry was pretty much our sister armory. So that was located in Virginia at that time, but it is now West Virginia. West Virginia became a state in 1863. But it wasn't our sister armory for very long, because when Virginia seceded from the Union on April 17th, 1861, it made Harpers Ferry a target. So the US Army thought that the Confederacy was going to go in there and they were going to try to get those firearms out of there. It made perfect sense to do so. So Lieutenant Roger Jones of the US Army went to guard the armory the following evening. The only problem is he only had 50 regulars and 15 volunteers to help him guard that site. That is a hot spot at that time. So the Virginia militia, with 360 men, advanced on Harpers Ferry to capture those firearms. So Lieutenant Jones knew he was outnumbered. He wasn't going to get any reinforcements at that time. So if he can't beat them, burn it. So that's what Lieutenant Jones and his men, they set fire to the armory and its buildings to keep the weapons out of Confederate hands before retreating across the Potomac River. Now, 15,000 firearms were destroyed in that fire there. But when the pro-Southern militiamen arrived, they were able to extinguish a lot of that fire to salvage a lot of the machinery and transfer it down to the Confederate Armory in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia. Also, Stonewall Jackson went in there on the 28th, so 10 days later, and he was able to get the rest of the machinery out of there as well. So they totally cleaned it up there. You can still visit Harpers Ferry today. It is, again, our sister site. We do give them a hard time when we see them about, well, at least we didn't burn our armory down. It is beautiful. It's at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. And also, if you hike on the Appalachian Trail, it is at the halfway point there too. So now we're going to jump about 80 years ahead, and we're going to start talking about World War II at the Armory. So when Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland in September of 1939, the Armory's budget increased by 250%. Unlike World War I, where many people felt the Springfield Armory was not ready for that war, they were absolutely ready for World War II. So employment skyrocketed at this point, and the workforce was much more diverse, with women being employed. So women comprised 20% of the workforce by June of 1942, and 43% the following year. So you can look on the graph here and see how employment peaked at just under 14,000 people at the spring of 1943. Between September and October of 1942, some 1,600 women were hired as demand for weapons on the battlefield grew. And when you look at this chart, again, you can see how quickly that went. A lot of the men were deferred because they had such a specialty in their jobs at the Armory. And another thing that I was like really surprised at is the diversity in the workforce. First, I think women in the Armory must have really changed the dynamics once they started flooding in. The Armory wasn't really prepared at that time, you know, even something as simple as restrooms. So a lot of changes took place as well to accommodate women there. But if you look on this chart, it is truly a melting pot there. The employment, you have people from the West Indies and Germany, from Poland, Greece, Sweden, Turkey, all over the world, they work there. And I'm always so impressed with that diverse workforce. So the women who worked at the Armory were called WOWs, Women Ordnance Workers, and they worked for the Army Ordnance Department. So Rosie the Riveter, to me, has nothing on these WOWs. It's kind of like the Battle of the Bandanas in a way. You have Rosie the Riveter with just her white dots on her bandana, but if you look at the WOW bandana, it may look like a bomb, if you look closely on there, but it's actually an iron hand grenade with a powder charge and a fuse, which had to be lit before throwing. So the use of this shell and flame by the Ordnance branch dates back to about 1832. So from an advertisement in the July-August 1943 issue of Army Ordnance, the advertisement said, and she wears the WOW bandana, water repellent, washable, dustproof. The WOW bandana, designed in accordance with U.S. Army specification, is an attractive, safe, and unifying head covering to identify women ordnance workers. Every woman in your plant will want one. So I am curious, I have another question for you. If anybody, their mother, their father, aunts, uncles, any family members that you had worked at the Armory.
So again, the chat box is available, and I've just turned on the option for anybody to unmute themselves if they'd like.
That is surprising that usually I get so many people who say like their relatives or if anybody has lived in the area when the Armory was open, do they remember, do they have memories of the Armory at all there? You guys are a very quiet group. All right, so let's see here. Now, another reason for bandanas was safety. And I love the picture of these two women here because they look like they're squaring down for a smackdown or something here. The guy doesn't seem to be paying much attention here, but that is hair wrapped around a rod. And so there had been accidents at the Armory with women getting their hair caught in the machinery. So this is definitely a safety, like a publicity photo for safety at the Armory, why those bandanas were important at that time to be worn at the Armory. So here we have some women ordnance workers, and women would take the jobs, any jobs that the men were doing before they enlisted. So the very unique part of this is if women were doing the same job as men, they were getting paid the same amount as well, which was pretty unique during that time. So we have Mary Smith, she's on the right. She was the first woman who worked in the forge. I don't know why she would want that job. When you think of, You know, there was no OSHA at that time. There was no air conditioning at that time. That was like a very, very hot job, but she worked there. And then the woman on the left, she has her M1 rifle in a C-clamp, and she's working on some trigger assemblies on that one. So many of the women who took jobs at the Springfield Armory took on many of the manufacturing roles that once were held previously only by the men. They saw working at the Armory as their patriotic duty in order to help the boys overseas with the war. So the Armory also attempted to pair specific women up with specific jobs according to their natural physical abilities. So they took aptitude tests to see how women fared in particular job categories within the Armory. So this proved very beneficial and cost-effective for the Armory. And then they were wondering why some women weren't applying at first. And come to find out, like, managers actually walked the neighborhood and went door to door asking why they were not working at the Armory. And they found out that childcare was an issue. So the Armory took note of this and opened a childcare facility across the street at the High School of Commerce. And they felt having their child in daycare was very patriotic to them. So what was the Armory manufacturing that was going to help win this war? It was the Garand M1 rifle. So some people call it Garand, John Garand. He was from Quebec, but we kind of use the Americanized version of Garand. And he is the one who designed this M1. He was born in Quebec, one of 12 children, and moved with his family to Jewett City, Connecticut. He worked in textile mills. He learned the machinist trade in other mills, and he worked in a precision tool factories in Providence, Rhode Island, and also New York City. During World War I, he designed a lightweight, fully automatic machine rifle, but it was actually rejected by the US Army at that time. But all was not lost for him, because he was hired at Springfield Armory in 1936, after 17 years of working under very strict military specifications. The M1 was accepted as the standard shoulder arm of the United States Army, and 4 years later by the US Marine Corps. And George Patton said, "I consider the M1 rifle the greatest battle implement ever devised." So when we go back, and that question of, was the Armory ready for World War II? They were, because in 1936, this M1 rifle was already adopted by the US Army. And it wasn't until 1939, when Hitler was invading Poland, that the US Army was getting concerned about the war. And so they were all set to go. And again, the budget jumped 250%. And the only rifle that they were really manufacturing at the Springfield Armory was this M1. So that was their main focus. So production of the M1 peaked in January 1944 with 122,001 manufactured in that month alone. And a rough translation of that is 3,936 rifles per day, or 164 rifles per hour. So Springfield Armory produced 3,526,922 M1 rifles from 1932 to 1945. But all throughout the history, that 174 years of history, we never manufactured those firearms by ourselves. We always used private contractors, from the Springfield Charleville in 1795 all the way to the M14. That was the last rifle that the Armory manufactured. And all through history at the Armory, we always used private contractors to help us. So we manufactured about 3.5 million M1s. Altogether, there was probably 6 million that were manufactured. And so Springfield Armory just had an impact throughout the world because all these rifles were being sent everywhere, Iwo Jima, Normandy, Africa, Italy, all over. And it always amazes me how many people don't even realize what Springfield Armory and its impact on history. So this was in the Armory Newsletter, which I will discuss in a few minutes. But this is one of my favorite drawings that I've seen in the Armory Newsletter. So you have the woman on the left who is an inspector. She's got her micrometer in her hand, and she's passing an M1 rifle to an armory worker who he's standing on a gear of some sort. And then he is passing that on to a GI soldier. And then you have the Japanese running up the hill, and you have the armory in the background. So you'd see there was a lot of drawings like this in the Armory Newsletter. So these soldiers of productions, that's what they called some of the employees, they worked round the clock, 6 to 7 days a week. And occasionally the shops at the armory were ordered to work 7 days a week for 2 weeks straight. And then the third Sunday was reserved for general equipment maintenance. And the third shift wasn't discontinued until about 1944. So the employees worked all the holidays, including New Year's Day. You earned extra days pay, and on Thanksgiving. And on Thanksgiving Day in 1942, I found a memo that said the employees were permitted to have a 30-minute lunch period instead of the normal 20-minute lunch period. So that was very kind of them. And I know probably many of you have had to be away from your families to work on a holiday, which is always hard, but morale was always very, very high at the armory during World War II. So I just want to read to you an excerpt called Soldiers of Production that an armory employee called R.J. Alden wrote for the Armory Newsletter in January of 1942, just so you can get an idea of just the morale and the pride they took in their work at the armory. We dedicate the work of our hands to our soldiers and sailors and all people throughout the world who want to live in peace and freedom. Our thousands of whirring machines stamp, cut, grind the parts that make the finest weapons of the world. As each workman senses his individual responsibility, our production rises and rises. Our fighting forces must have guns, tanks, ships, and planes. We will give them these weapons, shining, fine, accurate, and made with our strength, our hands, our hearts, and our souls. This is our solemn and holy promise to the soldiers who are fighting for us and to the country which we love. We are soldiers of production in the shops and the offices. We will keep the wheels turning night and day to produce the weapons needed for the defense of our nation and the perpetuation of our ideas. We pledge this. And this is the pledge for every true American. In the long days ahead, you can remember the promise, America, and remembering it takes courage. For at the end of the road is victory for democracy, final and complete. So again, they had such pride in their work here at the armory, and they knew these firearms were going to the front lines. So there were post restaurants and cafeterias were open so employees could purchase a hot meal without having to leave the armory campus. A lot of times they would lock the gates. So once you're in, you're in. And they're always worried about sabotage and such. I always like the sign on this one for the peach sundae for 15 cents. So why would you eat elsewhere? There was blackout and air raids were practiced regularly during this time as well. So I don't know how many of you have heard about the Army Navy E Award, and that was presented to companies during World War II whose production facilities achieved excellence in production. So by war's end, the award had only been earned by 5% of more than 85,000 companies involved in producing materials for the war effort. And the really neat part is the Springfield Armory received this award twice. And so this here is an honor guard. It's a Native American honor guard that was out of Fort Devens. So this was a very, very big ceremony that they had. And this was done right in front of the Arsenal Museum. So basically where our parking lot is now for the museum, they built this grandstand there for this ceremony. And then if you're working there at the time, this is your ID badge, but you also got this special E on your badge as well, that you were there as part of that production. So the Armory Newsletter, this is what they're all reading. This was a publicity photo for the Armory Newsletter, was published in-house each month during wartime by the employees to increase morale. It was pretty much like a gossip rag. The newsletter was pretty funny. Employees from different departments were encouraged to submit news for the newsletter about wartime production, birth announcements, poems, clubs, sports, former employees, news from the front line, jokes, cartoons, all sorts of things. So in no way could this Armory Newsletter be published today, at least not without a lawsuit, probably. It was pretty racist, sexist, and definitely not politically correct, but you have to think of the time period when this was published at that time. So keeping morale up was really important to management. Happy employees meant higher production. So they would have lunchtime concerts. Just to back up, this is also another drawing that was in the Armory Newsletter there. So you have the Mr. Muscular Armory employee there. And there's on your left, that was Dr. Seuss who drew that one. And the one on your right, it says the woman's place is in the plants or pants. So again, that's just an example of what would be in these newsletters. So this is, they would have lunchtime concerts on a regular basis. The Federal Music Project was part of the WPA, the Work Projects Administration. They did a lot of the work at the Armory, like putting in new sidewalks and actually mowing the fields and such like that. So the Music Project, that was from 1938 to 1943, but unfortunately it was phased out in 1943 for some reason. Its peak was around 1938. And it was definitely not all work and no play at the Armory. Another morale booster was clubs and teams. And there were many clubs and sports teams like bowling, tennis, golf, hockey, baseball, rowing, archery, and intramural sports, which was always surprising to me. There was basketball and more. And they had clubs for a bridge club, lunch club, swing band, defense war bond, a Red Cross, all sorts of clubs, just to, again, keep people happy there. So it was kind of funny because many of the teams would challenge each other, and this was all in the Armory Newsletter. So one of them was the bowling team and just what they wrote. So I just want to read what they wrote in one of their challenges. So the 5 bachelors, that was the name of their team, from the water shops extend a challenge to any bachelor girls team from the hill shops to participate in a bowling match. Stakes will be the match and supper to follow. Editors at the Armory News responded, while the Armory News is printing this item as received, it absolves itself of all responsibility should any romances develop. So I can't even begin to tell you also how many marriages came out of the Armory. To me, it was it was incredibly social there as well. And again, like I said, once women started working there, it really changed the dynamics of the Armory. So another thing that they really looked forward to were the dances. And this is one of my favorite ones that they did, the On to Victory dance in February of 1943. So it was held until 3 a.m. and that is so all the shifts could attend. And I do believe the woman band leader who is in this picture, I think her name is Judy Kane. So if anybody can correct me on that, super. That was really rare to have a female band leader at that time. And I would ask you if anybody knew where this was, but this is at the Springfield Symphony Hall where the orchestra plays. And this is before they had seats in there. So that was pretty neat there. And then the WOW bandanas were given out at that time. So you can get a white one with the red ordnance grenades on it, or the red with the white ordnance grenades. And this was a huge morale booster at that time to get these bandanas. And then also they were asked to sign a victory pledge. So someday I would love to organize another On to Victory big band dance and do it just as they did in 1943. So I'd ask if anybody recognizes this band leader. I'm sure many of you do. This is Benny Goodman. He played at the Armory on September 29th, 1943. To commemorate this, every year we have a big band concert in July outside behind the Armory on our historic grounds. Unfortunately, we have not done it the past 2 years, but I'm starting to have more big bands, like 2 or 3 throughout the summer. So definitely next year, keep your eye on our website or our Facebook page because we are looking forward to bringing that big band back. So if you can dust off your dance shoes and get out there. So unfortunately, toward the end of World War II, the layoffs started, even before World War II was over. So employment would never be as high as it was during this time. So we're going to fast forward 11 years to about 1956, when the current Chief of Staff requested a report from the Army Material Command of the Arsenal System. So the main reason for this request was to find out if private contractors could manufacture these firearms more efficiently. And on November 19th, 1964, the decision was announced by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara that the Springfield Armory was considered excess to the needs of the federal government. So needless to say, the citizens of Springfield were incredibly shocked by this news. A delegation from Springfield, they went to Washington, D.C. to plead the case and to try to save the Armory. And even though Robert McNamara, he was pretty impressed with all the research they went into the numbers. And at that time, what they wanted to do was, the headquarters for the Army Ordnance was in DC, but now they wanted to switch it to Rock Island Arsenal because of the Cold War at that time. So they thought it would be safer, more inland at that time. It was incredibly, incredibly political. They pleaded the case, but despite all its efforts, Robert McNamara still stuck to his decision to close the Armory. On April 30th, 1968, a ceremony was held on the green in front of the main arsenal, and the American flag was slowly lowered from atop the clock tower, as you can see in the picture. We have about a 10-second 8mm film of that flag coming down, and it is so sad to watch. The last employees left the Armory that day, the forge, the rail sidings, the laboratories, firing ranges, storerooms, officers' quarters, and administrative offices. everything went silent that day. It was basically the end of the era was over. But do not despair, all was not lost. Although not the same, in 1978, the American flag was raised once again, waving majestically over the Springfield Armories, and its doors reopened as the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. So today its legacy continues as a unit within the National Park Service, and I highly recommend you visit. Again, we are open currently Wednesday through Sunday from 9:30 to 4. We're not doing any big presentations right now, but if you come in, you can always see a Ranger highlight talk, or we've been doing a lot of walking tours of the grounds, and I also do the blank firing demonstrations. And for all of you, readers out there, if you want to know what it was like as a WOW working at the Armory, I highly recommend this book, The Wartime Sisters. It's historical fiction about two sisters who find their way to the Springfield and work at the Armory in World War II. So the author came here, I think in like 2018 or so, and she really nailed what it was like to work at the Springfield Armory at that time. So if you have any questions, I would love to hear those.
Thank you, Susan. So I just turned on the option for people to unmute themselves. So if you would like to turn on your microphone, you're welcome to do so. Just a reminder that this is being recorded. Everyone is welcome to use the chat box. So I don't have any questions at the moment. Someone did ask what WOW stands for, but then you had another slide right after. It was like you had timed it perfectly. So Women Ordinance Workers.
Yes. Yeah, they get them very confused with Rosie the Riveter. So like I said, I'd love to do a program called the Battle of the Bandanas and see like, who was first, but they both are coming in neck and neck at that same time. So it'd be kind of fun to get the Richmond Rosie the Riveter site to do a program with me so we can like, duke it out verbally on whose bandana was first. So stay tuned.
Would you have a comment? Somebody said wonderful, and
thanks, Betsy.
I don't have any other questions or comments at the moment. If you're not sure how to turn on your mic, generally it's if you kind of hover your cursor over the Zoom meeting, there's a microphone at the bottom. It'll say unmute or mute, depending on the current status. So if you click unmute, that would turn on your microphone.
Gosh, maybe I put people to sleep.
No, I don't think so. No, I say people shaking their heads, no.
Oh, hi, Jean.
Hi, Susan. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
I don't have a question, but I have a few comments. I got a real kick out of Mary Smith's frilly apron in that picture. Very frilly.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because the pictures I look at, like people don't even dress that nice to go to like the grocery store or Walmart, and they are in manufacturing here at the Armory and working these very filthy jobs, but they took such pride in their appearance there. And you should see this one dress, though. It's a Hawaiian print this woman's wearing, and she's got her bandana on to match, and she's got her lipstick and her fingernail polish, and she's feeling good, and having a good day.
We did have someone enter a question into the chat box. They asked if there were any women engineers, any women who worked as engineers at the Armory.
That's a great question, because I don't think there was for engineers, and I always have never found a woman testing some of the rifles too, but there were women in drafting. So in the drafting department. So I'm gonna dig some more in that, but from what I've asked Alex, our curator, he has said he's not yet come across that, but we still have a trove of archives that have just not even been looked into just yet.
Are there any ongoing projects about any research around the history or other research topics that people have been interested in?
It's always like ongoing, and it's interesting because that's the just the pleasure of working at the Armory is you never know what we're going to stumble upon, like each day. Who's going to walk through the door is always fascinating to me, because maybe it's a child who lived in one of the officers' quarters, but now they're elderly, and I always have questions for them, like, where's the mailboxes? Where'd you guys get the mail? I was always curious about that. We just, it's continuous what we're learning about there.
Okay. Somebody asked if all the renovations are complete.
Yes, finally. So come in and see us. Yeah, there was a lot of infrastructure repairs. If you come in, the floor has been redone. It's absolutely beautiful. And inside has been painted. And we have a photography exhibit up right now in our special exhibits section. And it's a photography exhibit of employees who were working there kind of in action at their job. So it looks like a little mini art gallery in there right now.
Great. And someone else asked, did women have any forte, i.e. assembly or machining?
So did they know, like, well, they had an apprentice and a training school there, a trade school. And so what they would do is, with all these women coming in, they train the men as managers and instructors, and then they're the ones who taught these women at their jobs that they formerly had. So there was a really good apprentice program there at the Armory for women.
Was there anything that they typically specialized in, or just anything that was needed?
Anything that was needed. And they'd even hire some blind people too, because a lot of it was handwork. And this one woman was saying they would chat on the line, like maybe working on trigger assemblies or very fine work where you need dexterity is very important. And she didn't know this person was blind till like 4 or 5 months later, because they would just have their heads down working these small parts. And so again, Springfield Armory was kind of cutting edge with the way they tested the employees to put them in the best place, which would benefit them and the Armory.
All right. What was the age range of women employees?
There were some high school students who worked there during the summertime, so as young as 16, and then, you know, way up there in age. There was this woman who worked there too. I think she had 18 children, so I can see why she worked at the Armory. She probably wanted some quiet time, you know. Even the forges were quieter than, you know, probably being at home. So it really ran the gamut. But there was like an after school program for young ladies to work there work there too.
Okay, great. Someone asked any exhibits themes, so I'm not sure if they mean that you've offered in the past or maybe that you have planned upcoming.
Our next one, you guys will probably be the first to hear it, so don't tell anybody I told you, you know. So instead of a small world after all, it's a small arms world after all. And so about all the different countries where we got shared ideas for rifle designs. So that's going to be our next special exhibit. Those usually run about 9 months. Yeah, and then each of us just focus on different presentations. So gosh, I don't think we're going to do any big presentations in the theater anytime soon, but next year I can't wait to get an audience back in there.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions or comments in the chat box. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share or ask? Again, you're welcome to unmute yourself or use the chat box. Just give people a minute just in case they have any final comments or questions. Any publication of the newsletters?
Do they meet the Armory Newsletter?
I'm gonna guess so, but if anybody wants to, if that person wants to provide it, yes.
Oh gosh, no, like I said, that would be a lawsuit in the making if we did that. It was, you know, if you ever want to come, if you ever want to see one of those, like come in and see me. I have some of those and I would love to share them. They are just, they have a women's corner column in there too. And they're just like pretty entertaining to read because again, it was a morale booster, and it's the talent of so many of these workers with their poems in there too. And like I said, intramural sports, like they had a girls basketball team called the Red-Headed Amazons that played a boys team. I forgot what their name was called because I couldn't believe the women like would call themselves this. And like they played against this men's team. It was a big deal. And I found that fascinating that the Armory was like, yeah, sure, let's do it.
So we have a couple of other comments. Just someone said thank you, and another person said that this was fascinating.
Nice.
So
good.
Thank you again, Susan.
And thank you again, everybody. I know everybody's like busy and stuff, but I really, really appreciate you tuning in and hearing a little bit about our history. So I appreciate that very much. So thank you.
All right. We've got some applause in the audience, both emojis and on the video. So thank you again, Susan. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope we learned something, had some fun, and that we'll see you again soon.
Sounds good. Have a good night.